As the previous video installation of the Beaumont Port Arthur campaign had covered the beginning of combat operations now being carried out by the Combat Engineer Battalion of the larger 6th PLAN Marine Brigade, as it had taken on its advance State Highway 96 before having had exited onto Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard, which took the whole battalion straight towards their primary objectives. As the combat engineers had arrived on site by 7 a.m. They were now in the process of capturing both the main port facilities and their critical energy industries, as well as also the 842nd Transportation Battalion's installation, while the rest of the battalion had pivoted to the north, where they would advance another roughly 1 mile before shedding off 3 additional combat engineer combat companies, leaving the 2 remaining combat companies of the battalion and the headquarters and support battalion to sit just off to the west of this area, whereby the 2 remaining combat companies would provide security for the headquarters and support company over the entire battalion, which commanded the operation, as well as also providing logistical support to all of the combat companies by trucking supplies to the headquarters platoons of each combat company, who in turn would then supply their combat platoons within each combat company of combat engineers. As this operation was now underway, with the operation just to the north of the critical main port facilities with their energy resources, as well as also the 842nd Transportation Battalion's installation now beginning at 7:30 just to the north of these areas. If we go to the map of the area within this 1.5 mile east to west by 1 mile north-south area, just to the north of the fighting that had broken out for the capture of the 842nd Transportation Battalion's installation, as well as also the main port of Beaumont and its major energy facilities. The fighting in this particular area, just to the north, would include the operation to capture and clear the 596th Transport Group's installation, as well as also the capture of the municipal buildings of the city of Beaumont, which included the courthouse and court annex buildings, as well as also the Port Authority building, as well as also the City Hall and Code Enforcement building, as this area would be captured relatively quickly. The fighting to capture and clear the installation of the 596 Transport Group would last from 7:30 to 11 a.m. as one of the buildings on site in the north of the peninsula installation was deemed as an important structure for use in the occupation and colonization operations to follow, as again, the chief objectives of the Combat Engineer Battalion was not only to capture intact the main port of Beaumont and all of its critical energy facilities intact, but also to preserve and capture intact the vital rail infrastructure of the port, as well as also the installations, as these railheads, including the smaller one in the 842nd Transportation Battalion's installation and the much larger railhead in the 596 Transport Group's installation, were deemed absolutely vital, as well as also the port infrastructure, which included the docking facilities and cranes and other implements, as across the Neches River, just to the northeast, was the footprint on the Vidor side of the Jefferson Energy Corporation, with its refinery and chemical plants and other offices and smaller buildings, as well as also smaller businesses that operated in the area as well. And of course, the relatively sizable Optimus Steel plant, which essentially was just to the east and southeast of the Jefferson Energy footprint in this area, which of course also had rail infrastructure, as there was a larger railhead just to the slight northeast, which was now under the complete and total control of the Reconnaissance Battalion of the PLAN 6th Marine Brigade as the three freshly arriving companies, as mentioned in previous installations, had arrived from eliminating a pocket of armed reactionary civilians before arriving in the Vidor area to bolster the single company already holding the vital I-10 Neches River Bridge, as effectively by this point, the U.S. military forces in the heart of Beaumont were now, for all intents and purposes, completely surrounded, as all remaining entry and exit points to the city had been completely and totally cut off by the swift arrival of the Air Assault Battalion of the PLAN Marine 6th Brigade, seizing the State Highway 96 bridge in the north of Beaumont, which was left intact after the massive cruise missile barrage on bridges from PLAN naval vessels, as well as also the I-10 bridge in the southwest of Beaumont, and the Recon Battalion seizing the Neches River I-10 bridge on the Vidor side, as the PLAN Marines of the Combat Engineer Battalion had continued to roll a mile to the north before dispatching three additional combat companies into the area. One combat company would be tasked with the assault, capture, and clearance operations of the 596 Transport Group's installation, which sat on a peninsula, as this company would effectively cut off all entry and exit points from land, as they would effectively roll up along the perimeter fencing and eliminate all opposition before dispatching dismounted troops to clear the facility and capture it and raise the national flag of China and the CCP regime party flag over the last remaining intact building on the site, as this would signify the complete and total capture of this vital objective, as also as the combat engineers were rolling into the heart of the city's administrative area. They would quickly capture this area within roughly an hour's time by 8:30, although in the north, the northernmost company of the combat engineers would be tasked with essentially carrying out a relatively lengthy standoff with the 200 military personnel that were within the headquarters building of the U.S. Military Sea Lift Command, as the Rear Admiral in overall command of the entire U.S. Military Sea Lift Command and the command echelon as his staff and other vital personnel were deemed too important to liquidate, and thus they would be taken alive, as eventually, after withering down defenders as the real-time AI battlefield data processing system through the use of the quadcopter ISR assets constantly circling the building, would ensure that those personnel firing out of the windows were not high-value individuals or high-value targets, and thus would not be return fired upon, and the weapons choices that would be utilized against this building, as it was wanted as much intact as possible, would be relatively limited to only small arms fire and also 12.7 millimeter heavy machine gun fire. This was to mitigate the possibility of essentially eliminating any of the high value individuals that were within the building. However, any targets outside of the building, including the LMTV trucks pulled up in front of the building, as well as the two Max Pro MRAPs and up-armored Humvee with their crew serve weapons aboard, which were M250 cals, were fair game for the dispatched FPV drones launched by the FPV drone operators in the headquarters platoon, which was just off map of this particular company, as well as one of their three combat platoons circling around the facility to take up positions on the opposite side of the rail embankment, whereby they would put further pressure on the building by laying down fire into the front of it, as one platoon of this combat company would be tasked with the absolute total seizure and clearance of the building, and would also, besides their lethal weaponry, equip their dismounted troops with non-lethal weaponry such as flashbangs and tear gas, and also rubber ammunition for use against the vital high-value targets, so as to ensure that they could be taken alive and interrogated post-victory over the invasion to ensure excellent intelligence for use in the counterinsurgency operations that were surely to follow the victory and occupation, as the colonization efforts were to be underway and all resistance was to be mercilessly and brutally put down by the coalition forces, as this was to become New China. And Beaumont, Port Arthur area was a major, important, critical region for the soon to follow colonization operations, as the port facilities and rail infrastructure would be vital for use for the same purposes that the U.S. military had used them for the deployment and redeployment home of U.S. military forces, in turn would then become the sites for the deployment and redeployment of Chinese and some of their other coalition forces into and out of the nation for occupation duties, as the rail infrastructure would aid massively in transporting many of the freshly arrived coalition units to their new forward operating bases throughout the nation, especially in the south central invasion sector, within which the Beaumont Port Arthur battle space was a part and a keystone for the coalition's future operations in the region. As the company that was rolling into the area to seize control of the 596th Transport Group's installation would end up having to roll up to the rail embankment which led into the railhead of the facility and engage squads of U.S. Army Reserve troops that were outside of the installation, as some had already fled the installation in panic, as operations for defense were now in flux, as the command elements of the U.S. Army Reserve and other military forces were in a complete and total disarray, as their forces were now in shambles after having had been mercilessly attacked by demolition charges placed by MSS, ISI, and Ministry of Intelligence operatives of the coalition, as the Chinese MSS, Pakistani ISI, and Iranian Ministry of Intelligence had planted charges strategically into the motor pools on site, as well as certain buildings, to cause maximum panic, as the tandem anti-satellite, cyber strikes, and electronic warfare assets ensured that all American communications, including redundant communications such as radar, which were affected by the electronic warfare assets, were brought completely offline, and therefore the U.S. military forces would be at the complete mercy of the brutal onslaught of the coalition forces, as following this immediately, as the operatives had egressed these facilities, massive strikes had occurred with tactical ballistic missiles, which included DF-15B and DF-11A tactical ballistic missiles, as a total of 8 were fired, 4 of each type, and some of these missiles, a total of 6, had been split between the two facilities, which were then followed up 2 hours later by Club K, which were container-based cruise missile systems, which were disguised, which belonged to the Russians, as well as the Chinese YJ-18C container-based cruise missiles, had struck the same sites, as these missile strikes had eradicated many vehicles in the large motor pool area of the 596 Transport Group site, as well as certain buildings that were deemed non-essential for the occupation to follow, including on the 842nd Transportation Battalion site. The artillery strikes that were soon to follow, as the Combat Engineer Battalion was advancing towards the area, being fired by the PLZ-07 howitzers of 2 firing batteries from the Howitzer Battalion of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade, would constantly rake up and down through these facilities, pounding certain buildings and concentrations of personnel on these sites, with very accurate but concentrated 122 millimeter howitzer shell fire as this massive barrage was beginning to come in, all of it ISR and real-time AI battlefield data processing system directed. The pre-prepared strike packages put together and sent to the FDC elements in each firing battery were highly accurate and exceedingly well calculated artillery strikes. And as these strikes came in, this punishing barrage simply smashed the defending forces while they were in certain buildings and as they had emerged from hiding places in sewage and drainage systems, as well as in certain basement levels of certain buildings that had not yet been hit, only then to be horribly and mercilessly wiped out by the massive shell fire as it was now beginning to come in at this time, as some American forces again had fled both installations, some fleeing toward the buildings in the port area, which, of course, the Americans wisely understood that were vital objectives of the PLAN Marine forces, as the near distant petrochemical, and refineries were absolutely vital objectives for the PLAN. The American forces rightly understood that these buildings were to be spared, and thus these would be outstanding positions from which to effectively try to seek cover and possible concealment from the massive attack being carried out by the PLAN Marine combat engineers as they arrived into the area and had begun to saturate the U.S. military bases with heavy artillery fire, as well as also their potent ground-based assets, which included their vehicle-based firepower from their infantry fighting vehicle versions of the ZBD-05 amphibious armored fighting vehicles, as well as also even the GSL-130 armored engineering vehicles, which had a very potent weapon at their disposal, which was their rocket-guided plastic explosive line-clearing charge, which could not only clear paths through minefields, but could also destroy certain other obstacles as well as enemy positions and the personnel manning certain positions, as well as also the quad-legged, heavily armed combat robots would also be deployed, as each combat engineer company had 5 of these systems at their disposal, as well as 10 of the unarmed versions with robotic arms to both remove and also help place obstacles and or demolition charges. And also, even more destructive was the DJI disposable demolition robots, which were available in large quantities and would be utilized to great effect in these combat operations by the combat engineers, in conjunction with their powerful drone capabilities, such as their FPV drones, which are very surgical yet very destructive weapons, as well as also their CH-901A loitering munitions, although the PLAN Marines were not as heavily armed with these and many other weapons as the PLA ground forces or Army was. They were still able to fire the single tube versions, which could be equipped with either fragmentation, HE, or heat warheads, depending on the target type and the objectives at hand. As the fighting grew more intense, as the PLAN Marines and the non-combat logistical and support American troops clashed throughout this particular part of the city, ambushes occurred from within certain buildings that had already been cleared or taken by the PLAN Marines, and also likewise fighting would occur as the American Army reservists would likewise take positions in certain buildings and attempt to lay down fire from these positions as well. As these clashes were underway, the fighting, as now it begun in the northern map by 7:30 a.m., by 8 a.m. or 30 minutes later, the combat company in the south, as they had deployed all 5 of their heavily armed combat robots to attack the defensive positions, as this drainage ditch on the edge of the perimeter was now being used as a trench system, the 12.7 millimeter heavy machine gun equipped armed combat robots lit these areas up heavily with their fire, as also FPV drones were deployed to strike certain targets in these defensive positions and in the rubbled positions that were former buildings on the installation that were heavily annihilated by the missile strikes and incoming artillery strikes that were now following. As the artillery had come in mercilessly, so too did the FPV drones, as the headquarters platoon off map had deployed 4 of these from their FPV drone operators, and also CH-901A loitering munitions, 2 deployed by the headquarters platoon's drone operators of the company attacking the municipal area, and 2 deployed by the headquarters platoon of the forces of the company attacking the 596 transport group site. And these, from both headquarters platoons of each company, were equipped with HE warheads, which could easily destroy lightly armored vehicles such as MRAPs and up-armored Humvees, and also, of course, soft-skinned vehicles and certain defensive positions. As the armed combat robots, as the green indicated that these vehicles and robots were taking small arms and other fire from these forces in the trenches and rubble, as there were also forces just off the map in this corner of the installation, which linked up effectively with the 842nd Transportation Battalion's installation, which was now also under assault at this time and would be taken relatively quickly just to the south of the peninsula across the inlet. Artillery was now beginning to slam the area, and these forces exchanged fire very briefly as the 12.7mm fire into these trench positions, followed by FPV drone strikes, as well as also a strike from one of the 2 loitering munitions, as 2 other FPV drones would strike personnel taking position in the rubble. These vehicles, as they were in a staggered vehicle column formation moving through this parking lot, as this was the road alongside the perimeter fence, would effectively break off of their formation and continue on, leaving a platoon here with the other 2 platoons continuing to this rail embankment as they were taking fire effectively on 2 sides. As this squad-sized formation had run to help this other squad by the embankment laying down fire, they were quickly destroyed by the very powerful vehicle-based fire from the 30mm autocannons and 12.7mm W85 heavy machine guns, as the turret gunners were now on full alert and laying down enormous volumes of fire, as the quadcopter assets constantly mapping the battlefield in real time in conjunction with the high altitude assets circling the battlefield and the satellites above them. The real-time AI battlefield data processing system, as they map the area in real time, were constantly sending down through the combat data links the angle and traverse calculations for vehicle-based weapons and even for dismounted forces to advise them on how to deploy their weapons most effectively. And the AI had revolutionized warfare to the point to where the KIA to WIA ratios had more than just evened out. Now there were more KIAs than WIAs due to the high degree of accuracy of all deployed weapons of the coalition forces, especially the Chinese and Russians, who had implemented the real-time AI battlefield data processing system by combining both of their capabilities together. As China was the world leader in AI and Russia not far behind, this system was a nearly ubiquitous system across the entire nationwide battle space, as the whole nation had effectively, for all intents and purposes, become a massive war zone, as some of the American personnel had fled the installation and tried to cross the rail drawbridge, which effectively connected the Vidor side to the Beaumont side. A grouping of 40 personnel would effectively get across this river, the Neches River, across the rail bridge. However, they were now at the mercy of the PLAN Marine recon troops of the 3 freshly arrived companies, as in this particular area in question across the river, a portion of a single company can be seen with the rest of their forces behind, as they had just freshly cleared out this area and were in the process of wrapping up the clearance of the docking facilities and petrochemical plant of Jefferson Energy along the Neches River. As they had moved out, they were to take positions alongside of the structure, as they had earlier taken some fire from these Max Pro MRAPs that were part of the QRF force trying to defend the 596 Transport Group's facility, as they take took position on the other side of the building. Return fire would be meted out by the 12.7 millimeter Jianxi heavy Gatling machine gun, as this Gatling 12.7 millimeter machine gun had a much higher rate of fire than standard 12.7 millimeter heavy machine guns, and could thus lay down a devastating wall of lead. And these Lynx armored all-terrain vehicles that equipped the recon companies of the PLAN Marine 6th Brigade's Recon Battalion were now in position guarding the freshly captured footprint of the Jefferson Energy industrial site, as well as Optimus Steel just to the south and east of there, as there were two squads on this particular map in place, as two Lynx armored all-terrain vehicles had pulled into the area, and another squad had pulled in along the rail embankment, taking up positions along the rails, whereby they would attempt to put up stiff resistance against those that were laying down fire at them from across the Neches River, as they would utilize their small arms, their Type 69 rocket-propelled grenade systems, and even the occasional HJ-08 man-portable ATGM, which was devastating. They could not use their 35 millimeter grenades, as the distance was too great for these weapons. However, the other weapons in use were more than enough to handle the threats across the river as they fired from their positions along the rail embankment. As this fire was briefly exchanged, artillery came in and smashed these Max Pro MRAPs with direct hits and hits all around the vehicles, and destroyed these two LMTV covered trucks and this squad of personnel just outside of them at this point in time. As also, this building would be targeted by one of the two firing batteries alone that were devoted to this operation, and would fire repeated 122 millimeter shell strikes on and around the building to annihilate the 120 defenders that were holed up inside, as the calculations for gunnery for the artillery forces from the real-time AI battlefield data processing system strike packages put together were absolute and precise. The firepower delivered was fired with such accuracy that no damage whatsoever at all had been done to the rail or port infrastructure, and the damage was very well targeted and very well compressed into specific areas, as the defending forces were taking a position in the rubble of the destroyed buildings that had earlier been destroyed. The attacks now being levied by the PLAN Marine Combat Engineers, with their massive artillery support and their support from their heavily armed combat robots, FPV drones, and their armored engineering vehicles, as well as ZBD-05 infantry fighting vehicles, was simply far too much to bear, as also the DJI disposable demolition robots, each with a 4-pound C4 charge, were now also being utilized to clear the area of defending forces, as the fighting was now growing very intense, as the installation was now fully cut off, and the forces on each side were being pummeled by artillery strikes, also FPV drone strikes, and vehicle-based firepower, as the staggered weapons of the column of vehicles was now levying enormous firepower on either side of their convoy formation as they rolled into place along the perimeter, whereby they also, with artillery and direct fire from the lead IFV's 30mm autocannon and 12.7mm heavy machine gun, wiped out this squad, taking a position along these rail embankments by the rail bridge just outside of the perimeter fencing. As that had occurred, the fighting just on the other side of the rail embankment was already making great progress, as these two rolling T formations, these two squads and their rolling T formations, captured the empty courthouse building, with an armed combat robot entering as well from their company, and another taking position outside the building according to standard building clearance procedures, as this platoon and all of its vehicles would wait outside of these two buildings, the courthouse and court annex. They too, according to building clearance procedures, were able to render assistance to the troops now clearing out the buildings. They would leave one squad of their rear vehicle in a double column rolling shield formation, also outside to render assistance if need be. However, the court annex building was also empty, as two armed combat robots and two rolling T formation squads from this platoon had entered and cleared this building, finding it empty. And they would then briefly exchange fire from the buildings against the squad-sized personnel that were inside the Port Authority building, while this platoon and this other platoon of the three combat platoons just to the north of them were now rolling into position to begin to dismount their troops to clear these buildings in rapid order. Although there were American military personnel in the area, mainly Army reservists and squad-sized formations, the armed reactionary civilians in the cyan color inside of this building numbered a total of 15, and this building would be captured and cleared after the stack teams would breach the building and mercilessly cut down the defenders inside as they methodically moved through the building with surgical precision and high effectiveness and rapidity, as the operation to capture the municipal buildings would go over relatively fast and relatively smooth, as the PLAN combat engineer Marines moved in for the literal and proverbial kill, as the saying could be said. As they moved into the area, the forces to the north of them had already since pulled into position and were now moving in to conduct a lengthy, hours-long standoff that would last from 7:30 to 1 p.m. in the afternoon, by which time, as the PLAAF, or Chinese Air Force's two squadrons of J-10 fighter aircraft had conducted their RTB by no later than 9 a.m., they by then would just be returning along with the VVS, or Russian Air Force squad, of Su-34 strike aircraft. Both of these aircraft in their three respective squadrons, one squadron of Su-34 strike aircraft and two of the J-10 fighter aircraft, would be returning after a rapid RTB whereby the J-10 fighter aircraft would be mostly rearmed with predominantly air-to-ground munitions, with the exception of a single PL-15, or a PL-12 rather, on each wingtip as per SOP for self-defense, although there was no American air power left to contend with. This was done out of standard operating procedure, with the rest of their armaments being predominantly air-to-ground precision munitions, as the Su-34 strike aircraft would likewise return with their massive heavy bomb loads aboard, and would then continue to support ground operations in conjunction also with the field artillery forces of the artillery battalion of the PLZ-07 self-propelled 122mm howitzers of the PLAN Marines 6th Brigade. As now the standoff would go on for some time in the north of this particular map for the U.S. Military Sea Lift Command headquarters building, a grouping of 80 armed reactionary civilians, fully realizing that this was a military building, the U.S. Military Sea Lift Command headquarters, had, after watching the building be assaulted with a number of vehicles and armed combat robots, had decided to run across the street to render assistance to the embattled U.S. military troops inside. Only 20 of the 80 personnel would make it into the building with their lives, as they would be mercilessly cut down by 30mm autocannon fire from this infantry fighting vehicle, as well as its 12.7mm heavy machine gun turret gunner, and also the heavy machine gun fire from this armed combat robot. Before this even occurred, at 9 a.m., as these vehicles had already rolled into place, and the lead vehicle of this column of this platoon had begun to lay down 12.7mm fire into the building, guided by the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, as all of the quadcopter assets of this company were now circling the building and looking through its windows as personnel appeared to try to fire out and return fire at the vehicles. This Edison Plaza had a grouping of approximately 10 armed reactionary civilians in it who would come out and carry out a kamikaze-like Molotov attack on this PLAN Marine infantry fighting vehicle. They would manage to drench the vehicle with 4 Molotov cocktails, as in this animation or illustration, if you will. One is being thrown from a higher floor, but would land short of its goal, this infantry fighting vehicle. However, the personnel that had rushed out of this building would come out so quickly and run so quickly towards the vehicle, there would be no time to react, although they would be mercilessly cut down by the armed combat robot and other vehicles. The vehicle would end up being set on fire to where its fire suppression system and also the crew using the fire extinguisher from the BII, or Vehicle's Basic Issue items, would not be able to put out the fires, as it would spread through the engine compartment and then into the cab of the vehicle, and thus the crew would bail, although one would bail on fire and be rolling around on the ground outside of the vehicle as he would get out just before the fire widely spread, and they would take position by their armored engineering vehicle, their GSL 130, that was parked behind the building in Edison Plaza, as the armed reactionary civilians, 20 of which would make it into the building. They would only barely replace some of the losses already sustained from the exchange of firepower between the PLAN Marine combat engineers on the ground and the personnel in the building, as the vehicle-based firepower from the 12.7 millimeter heavy machine gun, as the 30 mil was not being utilized, was already devastating enough, along with the armed combat robots as they picked off many of the defenders as they appeared, as the 12.7 millimeter round was an anti-materiel round and could shred through the flimsy walls of the building. These personnel were gradually being cut down bit by bit as they appeared, and as the grouping had tried to make it into the building by 9 a.m., just after which point the other platoon would leave their positions, come down this road, cross the rail embankment, and come to the other side. At this time, this squad-sized element, running through this sparsely wooded area, would break up into 2 half squads and bound in cover tactically, but would be cut down by the lead vehicle and this squad from the lead vehicle that had emerged and had taken position around their vehicle and laid down small arms fire against the approaching 2 half squads of U.S. Army reservists as they bounded and covered tactically towards the platoon of vehicles and now dismounted troops, as the other two squads of the second vehicle in the convoy and the 4th vehicle would disembark and take positions along the rail embankment to lay down fire against the building. The last squad would take position in the rear to watch the rear flanks along with the vehicle to provide mutual infantry and vehicle support, and the 3rd vehicle would dismount a squad to take position in a wedge formation to watch these directions across the river, as they too would provide mutual support with the vehicles. As these vehicles, these LMTVs along the front of the building, and this 50 cal up-armored Humvee and the 2 Max Pro MRAPs had already now been wiped out by the 4 FPV drones as operated by the headquarters platoon's drone operators, as they smashed into these vehicles and absolutely annihilated and decimated them, as these forces had been promptly wiped out by the time this platoon had come over the rail embankment, and these vehicles were destroyed, and these 20 personnel had by then made it inside. Kamikaze attack had occurred. Before all of this had even happened, at the opening of the battle, a lone MRAP, Max Pro MRAP, had left the facility out the main gate and had proceeded to try to obtain orders from the command element of the U.S. Military Sea Lift Command to try to effectively organize a defense of the installations in the area. However, the MRAP would never make it back, as it made it at the opening of this map to the front of the building, disembarked its grouping of personnel from the vehicle, a squad-sized element, who then returned to the vehicle. As the vehicle was leaving, the vehicle was horribly mauled by fire from the infantry fighting vehicle of this platoon on this street, as they utilized their 30 millimeter autocannon to rip the MRAP to absolute scrap, which they had achieved, as all of these forces, of course, being seen by all of the vehicle/squad level quadcopter assets working in unison to map the area in real time. There were effectively no forces that were safe anywhere in this area from the assault of these combat engineers, as they rolled through the area with relative impunity and slaughtered their enemies. As, again, this municipal area would be taken relatively quickly, although the defenders would fight vigorously both against this company as they rolled in to cut off the 596 Transport Group's installation, and this company that was rolling in to take the municipal buildings of this area. Eventually, this platoon would, after slaughtering this squad, breaking up into two half squads to attack around the building, would be destroyed by the vehicle-based firepower, and as these squads dismounted from their platoon, all five, two would enter to clear this building. One would peer around the corner with their lead vehicle, another would come around the lead vehicle from the second vehicle, and the third vehicle would dismount their squad to watch this direction as these two squads cleared this building. This platoon, as it moved into place, would, as there was a relatively lengthy exchange of fire between the forces in these three buildings for some time, and the squad had come around to try to lay down fire against the vehicles, they would be wiped out by FPV drone strikes and the usage of the DJI demolition robots, which were disposable. They simply blasted these personnel to absolute pieces, along with the firepower being levied upon them from the vehicles in the platoon. As they did take some fire, the fire rendered or returned against them was simply too much, including with the DJI disposable demolition robots, which blasted them to pieces. As these squads cleared this building, this squad came around the corner and held their position as they laid down fire against these personnel coming out from this building with vehicles, and this squad likewise laying down fire upon them, eliminating this squad. The other squads of this platoon, as these two squads had now come in to outflank the forces in the building who were concentrating on these buildings as they were exchanging fire for some time, these two squads entered the building. They breached the Port Authority building and were now proceeding to methodically go through the building in their stack teams and clear it out of the squad-sized element of defenders, which they managed to pull off with extreme ease and relatively quickly, as again the defenders had been focusing on a different direction as they had vectored their fire out the front of the building against the courthouse, which was occupied by these two squads and an armed combat robot, and the court annex building that was across the street occupied by two armed combat robots and these two squads from this platoon, as there were also vehicle-based fire being levied against the building from this particular ZVD-05, the second vehicle in the column. As they all had staggered weapons, they were laying down fire in support of the forces laying down fire in these buildings. Now they were easily finished off by the arrival of these two squads, as the squad had been destroyed by vehicle-based fire coming around the building, armed combat robot fire, DJI disposable demolition robot fire, and an FPV drone. The slaughter of these forces holding this area was absolutely epic in the worst possible way, as it was done with relative ease and somewhat quickly, as these two squads would leave one squad in the building to give fire support to the squad bounding across the street. Tactically, this one squad would clear this building of 15 armed reactionary civilian personnel across the parking area from the City Hall and Code Enforcement building, as these two squads from this platoon, with the other two squads clearing the Port Authority building, would dismount one squad as per standard building clearance procedures outside of this building, while two additional squads went in to clear it, as it was empty at this point. There was no combat in this building, although there would be combat inside of the building across the street, which also was a municipal annex building that would see firefights in the halls and rooms of the building as the combat engineers went through in their stack team formations, clearing out the defenders inside. As the municipal area was now effectively taken by the middle company of these three assaulting companies in the north of the overall Neches River port area, the forces that had made it across the bridge had very quickly been annihilated, as these two wedge formations of a platoon of this company had bounded and covered tactically before taking positions in these buildings where they would L-vector their fire in a very tactical manner against the grouping that had come around this building and decided to take this road to try to flee out of this area. Of course, it has to be understood at all times. The Americans had no ISR capabilities and thus no actionable intel, and wherever they retreated, they were easily seen right away and cut off and destroyed, as anything that could be seen could be destroyed. And thus, as the entire battlefield was being surveilled in real time and all of the movements were seen in real time, they had been seen on the installation, and the moment they had left the installation and crossed the rail bridge, they, of course, were easily seen, as the reconnaissance forces likewise are running their quadcopter assets along with all the combat engineer companies that were now across the river, capturing the main port of Beaumont with its critical energy facilities and also the military installations, the 42nd Transport Battalion's installation, and the 596 Transport Group's installation as well, as they had bounded and covered and taken positions in the buildings as these forces were crossing. As these personnel had come through and started to come on the road, a L-vectored fire wiped them out, along with heavy vehicle-based firepower from this particular Lynx armored all-terrain vehicle with its very powerful Jiangxi Gatling heavy machine gun, as the fire was absolutely ruthless and merciless. These forces were cut down rapidly as they had crossed into the area, absolutely annihilated by these forces, as the fighting would occur also in wooded areas on the Vidor side of the river. The U.S. Army reservists would be in heavy firefights, but would be at a severe disadvantage as they were so far away from the returning fire from the enemy forces that they, without ISR assets, could not properly direct their small arms fire at such a great distance, as it was very difficult to see their opposition as they had laid down fire, because they were now taking fire from PLAN Marines of the Recon Battalion's forces in the area that were also in wooded areas. As across the rail line in this area, this was a rail platform where cargo could be unloaded and offloaded, these forces of this platoon, or half platoon, had taken up position in this area as the rest of their platoon was off map, and were now laying down immense fire through these wooded areas at these personnel moving through the woods and along the rail embankment, as they simply were so far away. As again, this is a 1.5 mile east-west by 1 mile north-south area, and thus this was a relatively long distance. This is a mere half-mile distance, and the fire being returned from the PLAN Marines was absolute and precise, whereas the fire being levied by the U.S. forces mostly fell short, although the green signifies that they were being engaged, including this vehicle here, which was laying down heavy fire across the rail embankment. None of the American fire was accurate and splashed all around the area without hitting any of the PLAN Marines, and only a few rounds hit this particular vehicle. Nothing hit these vehicles or these troops, but these troops laid down precise fire that was ISR directed through their quadcopter assets and the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, mapping these forces in real time as they moved about the area, and thus they were able to respond rapidly before these forces had even made it fully across the rail bridge, as they were already seen leaving their installation. And thus, as the squad's in a diamond formation to watch all directions, this double column formation had just cleared this building and was now moving into place in between these buildings to take up position. These vehicles and some of their troops, two squads from as two Lynx all-terrain armored fighting vehicles, were effectively a single squad, as 6 personnel fit in each vehicle, making 2 squads per vehicle. Two vehicles per squad. These forces, all about the area, had finished clearing these objectives and were now in position to cut off any means of retreat across the Neches River. Again, it has to be understood at all time. Just to the north and off this map, to the north of this small lake, was I-10, and there was another PLAN Marine Recon Company, the first to arrive on scene along the Neches River, that was already occupying the I-10 Neches River Bridge and had been holding the bridge since 5 a.m. It was now long into the operation of the capture of the Neches River port areas and their affiliated high value objectives. And thus, as the area of the municipal buildings had now been taken by the center attacking company in the north, as by now in the south, the installation of the 596 Transport Group had since fallen to the PLAN Marine Combat Engineer Invaders, as they would plant their flag on the horribly gutted but last remaining building on the facility, as they would plant their national flag and also even the party flag to follow on the last remaining building on the 842nd Transportation Battalion's installation. The main port and its affiliated energy facilities would take longer to clear, and the clearance would last until 10 a.m. And this was only due to the fact that certain weapons had been off limits for use by the PLAN Marines, as they had to be extremely surgical in their operations in this area, as these buildings and their contents were deemed absolutely vital for use in the colonization procedures to occur after the victory. These aircraft had left the area again by 9 a.m. They would be returning approximately by 1 p.m. by the time this operation had come to a close. And the last operation to occur in the Neches River port area would be the capture, clearance, and the taking alive of the high-value targets within the U.S. Military Sea Lift Command building and the building itself. The building also had important contents that had immense intelligence value for use by the occupation forces, as the invasion would turn into an occupation. As the fighting against these forces that had crossed in three prongs across the rail bridge was over relatively quickly, as the recon troops efficiently annihilated the crossing U.S. Army reservists. The fighting to capture the 596 Transport Group's facility was well underway by this point, as the forces in the rail or in the drainage system turned trench had been wiped out by the use of DJI disposable demolition robots, heavy machine gun fire from the quad-legged armed combat robots, and also attacks from the FPV drones, and also loitering munition strikes from the HE warhead equipped to loitering munitions. CH-901As fired at targets in this area. Artillery fire simply smashed opposition, annihilated this building on the southeast of the peninsula, of the peninsular installation, annihilating 120 defenders inside. These MRAPs were simply annihilated by the continuous pummeling of 122 millimeter shell fire, as they even received direct hits on top of the vehicles, which simply ripped them to pieces. And these vehicles in the motor pool were also likewise smashed by artillery, as other vehicles had long since been destroyed by these missile strikes and the repeated strikes from cruise missiles, from the container-based cruise missiles, the YJ-18Cs and Club Ks. This squad had run the gauntlet of fire, taking position in the rubble, only to be wiped out by an FPV drone and DJI disposable demolition robot, with fire from the vehicles coming in. The machine gun emplacement, the sandbag machine gun emplacement with an M250 cal guarding the main entrance, was likewise destroyed by several repeated shell strikes from fire missions handed down to the PLZ-07 howitzers, which were now again mercilessly pounding this facility, and the combat engineers were now making their way into it to begin to clear it. Again, the clearance and capture of the facility would effectively be over with by 11 a.m., leaving only the fighting in the far north to continue until 1 p.m. or 2 hours later, as these forces were now bounding and covering into the facility. 5 armed combat robots would likewise move through the area, as 2 squads from the 3rd Platoon entered the facility. One entered this horribly gutted building from the missile strikes, which is nearly destroyed. It was horribly dilapidated. Another would take position here to watch this angle of approach, while the armed combat robots entered the facility through the rubble, and then this squad would eventually bound to this position to watch these fields of fire, while these two squads here, one would enter the rubble here, and then this squad would carefully bound around the rubble after these forces were annihilated, including this portion of this squad holding the machine gun emplacement and the rubble pile, and this squad that entered that were destroyed by vehicle and other types of systems. These two M113 armored personnel carriers and this up-armored Humvee and these two Max Pro MRAPs guarding the facility, the perimeter, were simply annihilated by 30mm autocannon fire, which ripped through the M113s as if they were nothing, like a hot knife through butter. As the M113 armored personnel carriers were also known as the Rolling Zippo and other types of names, as they were known to catch fire from many types of armaments, these vehicles simply sat as burning hulks of metal, with their crews simply annihilated inside, although they did try to resist with M250 cal fire, and some which had Mark 19 grenade systems mounted, like one with a M250 cal and the other with the Mark 19, and tried to lay down as much fire as possible against the much more well-armored ZBD-05 amphibious armored fighting vehicles, these IFV versions, and simply failed to do any real damage to them, as the return fire meted out was more than enough to shred all of these vehicles to absolute scrap, as well as the MRAPs, which were also pounded by precision artillery strikes, which hit all throughout this area, hitting the Humvee and the two MRAPs at about the same time as the vehicle-based fire had come in from the column of vehicles of this combat company of combat engineers. This squad dismounted to take position along the rail embankment, would support the advance of these squads here, as this squad come along the rubble would bound and take position as well along the rail embankment. This squad would temporarily take position in this rubble pile to have overwatch over this area to provide supporting fire, but eventually would then bound through the wreckage of these destroyed vehicles and take position along the rail embankment itself after these positions had been solidified and the vehicles were sitting back to provide them with support if needed. The personnel now all along the rail embankment were preparing to storm the main prize of the operation, which was the main building in the north of the installation that was to be taken intact, as this building was seen as highly important as it was directly connected to the chief docking facility of the entire installation, as this was a building for vehicles to effectively line up within, and it was a very large building. It would have to be contended with and fought over against the occupying 180 military personnel inside, which are mostly Army reservists. As a 596 transport group had attached Army Reserve components, the population on the installation was significantly larger than it normally was under normal circumstances, and thus these defenders had gradually been wiped out by massive artillery fire from the 16 available howitzers of the 2 available firing batteries devoted to operations in Beaumont, as they shifted fire constantly to pound new targets each time fire missions were handed down. They gradually, along with their vehicle-based and drone and robotic-based firepower, allowed for the combat engineers to move closer and closer towards their objectives. As they moved through the large motor pool parking area of the facility, they were preparing to plant their flag atop the building after it had been thoroughly and methodically cleared of all remaining defending forces that were inside. As this squad would bound to seize the entrance on the port end of the facility by this massive crane. This squad would bound to take this entry point of the building, while this squad would bound temporarily to take position in the rubble to provide supporting fire for this squad to enter, and this squad would enter with vehicle support if needed. Tactically, this grouping of 5 armed combat robots would advance to this position, shedding 2 off to enter the main railhead platform on the north side of the large railhead, where they would lay down fire to support the operations over here, where the 3 remaining armed combat robots would take position here to lay down supporting fire to allow this squad to breach and enter the building, while these 3 robots would then enter as well. A massive fight would ensue inside between 3 armed combat robots and 3 attacking squads, as they would deploy small numbers of DJI, disposable demolition robots, and they would only be deployed in a manner to where it did not hurt the structural integrity of the building itself, as the combat engineers would gradually maneuver through the massive facility and begin to clear it of defending forces, as they would move tactically about, using all of the clutter inside of the building, such as cargo containers and other types of cargo and even certain vehicles, as cover and concealment, as they would gradually sweep through this massive facility and begin to eliminate the defenders bit by bit inside. So again, they would deploy very powerful weaponry, including their armed combat robots, which not only could dish out heavy fire, but to a certain extent could take somewhat heavy fire, so long as it was mainly small arms fire and nothing heavier. As they move through the building, fortunately for the armed combat robots, the logistical and support troops inside of the U.S. Army Reserve had very little in the way of any type of real heavy weaponry, with some of their heaviest weapons being 40mm grenade tubes beneath some of their M16A2 rifles. And although they did have access to crew-served weapons earlier in the operation, many of these had either been wiped out or overrun in the process, and now they were effectively left with just their small arms and hand grenades and 40mm grenade tubes, and some equipped with M249 saws, or the squad automatic weapons, the 5.56 NATO light machine guns. As they now move through the area and were beginning to rapidly clear out the facility as they began to move through it, victory was soon to be assured, as Frank S. Besson, General Frank S. Besson, military logistical vessels sat submerged in pieces in the Neches River nearby. The final obstacle to capture this facility was in the process of being cleared, as the massive artillery strikes and the FPV drone and loitering munition strikes and the vehicle-based fire had simply eradicated everything in this installation. And by 11 a.m., as this building would be captured and cleared fully, with effectively no prisoners taken, as none wanted to be captured, even though they would have been treated rather humanely, they opted to fight to the very last, as they were horrified of the Chinese, and they went down swinging. But they would effectively create some PLA and Marine casualties in the process of this building being cleared, as the sizable number of defenders inside, despite their lacking effective heavy weapons, would still exact a small toll on the attackers as they moved in. As the municipal area, having already been cleared before 11 a.m., would see the operations in the north begin to take a different direction, as the gradual exchange of fire between the defenders in the building and the personnel outside was again beginning to take a toll on the defenders that had taken positions at the windows and tried to return fire on these vehicles and armed combat robots, as these 2 squads laid down fire from across the rail embankment. This area, this building, would soon be stormed and cleared by a whole platoon from this company here in the north, as the fields of fire of this company effectively cut off all means of escape, as they had full eyes on the front, they had full eyes on the side, and this side as well. Soon, this platoon, as they had come around the corner of this building, would now come up the street, right up to the front of the building, with their GSL-130 armored engineering vehicle clearing the way, and the GSL-130 would smash through the wall of the building with their plow and create a hole for the troops to storm the building. as they dismounted all of their squads from their vehicles. They dismounted in rolling T formations to watch the upper levels as they came into the building. And as they entered the building, they now were beginning to clear it methodically, floor to floor, as this was a multi-floor building. They would go through every floor of the building, through every hallway, through every room, through every closet, through every open floor, and clear the entire building. They would be also very cautious as they deployed their weapons inside. Again, they would have non-lethal weaponry to effectively take down the high-value individuals for capture, as they had tear gas and also they had flashbangs and, again, rubber rounds to be used against the high-value individuals. These quasi-elite combat engineers were very effective fighting forces. Essentially, they were an outstanding military force to be deployed against these key objectives. Although they were not special forces grade personnel, they were definitely more than capable of this particular undertaking. And as the real time AI battlefield data processing system advised these personnel on all of their actions, as they literally had all open source intelligence possible, as well as also all top secret intelligence possible, as the cyber warfare arm of the PLA, having had hacked all critical American systems, knew every single solitary secret of the U.S. nation, and would effectively feed it all into the real-time AI battlefield data processing system apparatus, and as all the floor plans and every detail of every domain of data was being crunched, the squad-level NCOs with their combat data links at the squad level, and also higher ranks, which also had these tablets, would be advised on all steps of the operation as they cleared floor by floor of this building. As many defenders already lay deceased by the windows of the building, and some even in the hallways just outside of certain rooms of the building, as the 12.7 millimeter rounds shredded through some of the walls and into other rooms. The remaining defenders were methodically, gradually cleared out, as the building had been stormed by 12 p.m., or the beginning of the afternoon, and the clearance of the building would take approximately 1 hour, as it was a very methodical and cautious building clearance operation against the defending forces that held the interior. Combat engineers were very cautious and precise and surgical as they carried out this very critical operation according to the key objectives they were to take. The operation would soon come to a highly successful conclusion, at least in this particular area, as there would be more operations to follow. However, the most important objectives of all were now in the process of being completely taken. And effectively, what would follow would be the final clearance of the keynote of Beaumont, which was important as it was in regard to holding their freshly captured key objectives, as they did not want any possibility of these objectives being harassed or possibly, in the worst case scenario, being retaken by any type of remaining resistance forces, be they armed reactionary civilian elements such as the militias that were encountered outside of Beaumont frequently, or whether it was just gaggles of ordinary armed civilians or possible remaining military personnel having had fled long since before the installations had been stormed and were hiding in other areas inside of Beaumont, as they could not conceivably escape as the city was cut off effectively. The only way out for the desperate ones was to try to swim across the river, but they would frequently find that no matter what they did, they were always seen by the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, as they had literal eyes in the skies at all times and could see all movement occurring on the battlefield. And thus, anywhere that anyone tried to escape, including swimming across the river, they could be promptly destroyed by an artillery strike, a drone strike, or airstrikes, thus effectively made escape from the city nearly impossible. Although Groupings of refugees had been left out through refugee corridors created on the major entry and exit routes remaining of the city. Any armed personnel spotted deemed a threat by the real-time AI battlefield data processing system of armed reactionary civilians would be outright annihilated, including any remaining renegade military personnel that had fled earlier from their installations, were trying to hold out against this devastating onslaught carried out by the PLAN Marine Combat Engineers. As vehicles sat in abject wreckage and twisted metal and total ruination on the military installations, including even the Carl R. Pipkin Army Reserve installation that was being stormed also at 7 a.m. by the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion, as this was their chief objective, along with then seizing the vital intersections of highways in the heart of Beaumont. The combat engineers, now in the process of completing the capture of their major chief objectives, were now about to plant the national flag of China and the CCP regime party flag, which was a red banner that bore the sickle and hammer. Though it was similar to the Soviet flag, it did not have a star on it. It was simply just the red banner and sickle and hammer. This was the Chinese Communist Party's banner. And as they planted both flags atop the building, by then, the combat engineers that had methodically, carefully, and surgically cleared the building had also captured their high-value individuals using non-lethal weaponry. So the flashbangs and tear gas especially came in handy for this objective, as these had been tossed into rooms containing the high-value targets. They simply could not withstand these non-lethals and were easy to wrangle up by the combat engineers using zip ties as they would don their gas masks, as the personnel in these rooms lacked any gas masks as they did not regularly carry these. The flashbangs as well were highly effective. Rubber bullets didn't even need to be utilized in these operations, so combat engineers could claim another victory notch in their belt as they raised their banners above the building. As by now, the national flag and party flag of China flew above the last remaining but horribly gutted building along the rail head of the 842nd Transportation Battalion's installation, as all the other buildings have been annihilated by artillery and missile strikes, as they were deemed unnecessary for further use by the regime of the CCP overall. They could be replaced with portable buildings, modular construction buildings, and other types of buildings during the occupation. Very few buildings would be left intact, such as the building on the north of the 596 Transport Group site, and this gutted building by the docks and the railhead of the 842nd Transportation Battalion's installation. As now this entire area was fully under control of the PLAN Marines, operations just several miles west to capture the Carl R. Pipkin Army Reserve site had also begun at 7 a.m. and would end by noon, just an hour before the operation to capture the U.S. Military Sea Lift Command and its command echelon had concluded. Next, in the operations occurring in the Beaumont Port Arthur battlespace, within this real-time hypothetical invasion documentary series highlighting fourth-generation warfare doctrines, the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion and their operation to capture the Carl R. Pipkin Army Reserve site and engage the remains of the 373rd Combat Sustainment Support Battalion will be covered in the next video installation. More to come next.